Hey guys, tonight let's slow things way down. Dim the lights, put your phone face down. Let history do that soft, blurry thing where it gently walks in circles and quietly judges everyone involved. Tonight, we're drifting into the rise and fall of the Tower of London. Not the action movie version, not the screaming, sword-swinging version, but the long, awkward, emotionally constipated version. The one where kings build giant stone buildings instead of going to therapy. Because of course they did. So get comfortable. This is a story about power, paranoia, spoiled royal children who grew into deeply unpleasant adults, and one extremely overworked building on the River Thames that saw everything and never once got a say in the matter. All right, let's begin. The Tower of London starts, as many bad decisions do, with William the Conqueror. Yes, that William. The one who showed up in England in 1066, won a battle, and immediately thought, great, now everyone here hates me. Which, to be fair, they did. William was a foreign ruler in a hostile land, surrounded by people who spoke a different language, followed different customs, and absolutely did not ask him to be in charge. Naturally, his solution was to build a massive stone fortress right in the middle of London. Because nothing says, please accept me as your king, like a giant reminder that you could crush them at any moment. So around the late 11th century, William orders the construction of what would become the White Tower. It's tall, it's square, it's heavy, and it radiates the energy of a man who does not trust anyone, including his own reflection. This wasn't just a castle, this was a statement. It said, I'm here, I'm staying, and if you get any ideas, don't. And that mood, that underlying paranoia, would pretty much define the tower for the next 900 years. Now, early on, the tower wasn't officially a prison yet. It was a royal residence, sort of. Kings stayed there occasionally, but not because it was cozy. They stayed there because it was secure. And medieval kings, as a rule, were never relaxed, ever. Imagine living your entire life assuming someone, somewhere, was actively planning to poison you. Because statistically, they probably were. So the tower slowly became a place where power gathered and where people who annoyed power mysteriously ended up. By the 12th century, the tower had already hosted its first high-status prisoners, which is medieval code for you're important enough that we won't kill you immediately. And from there, the tower leaned into its destiny. Let's gently float forward to King Henry II, a man who had everything. An empire stretching from Scotland to southern France, a brilliant legal mind, and absolutely zero emotional regulation. Henry II was energetic, intelligent, and famously incapable of sitting still. He also had a wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was smarter than him and knew it. That was not ideal. Their marriage began as a political powerhouse and slowly decayed into a Cold War fought through their children. And yes, the tower would be involved, because of course it would. When Eleanor supported her sons in rebelling against Henry, which sounds dramatic but was actually just another family disagreement in medieval Europe, Henry had her imprisoned. Not permanently, just long enough to make a point. She spent years under varying degrees of confinement, including time in the tower. A queen, locked away by her husband because medieval marriage counseling was limited. This is where we start to see the tower's dual personality. It wasn't just a dungeon, it was a place where royal embarrassment went to quietly think about what it had done. And royal embarrassment was plentiful. Now, fast forward gently to King John. Yes, that King John, the one from Robin Hood. And honestly, the stories didn't exaggerate much. John was petty, suspicious, cruel, and astonishingly bad at being liked. He lost territories, he taxed everyone, he argued with the church, he argued with his barons, he argued with reality. The tower under John became less symbolic and more practical. It was reinforced, expanded, because John trusted no one.
When his barons finally had enough and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, it was less a proud constitutional moment and more a collective sigh of exhaustion, and the tower just sat there watching another king slowly unravel. Now let's drift into the 13th and 14th centuries, when the tower really hit its stride as a holding pen for royal problems. Kings came and went. Each one brought new anxieties, new grudges, new cousins who suddenly needed to disappear for a while. Which brings us to Edward II. Edward II was not built for kingship. He preferred hobbies. He disliked administration. He adored his favorites with an intensity that made everyone else deeply uncomfortable. His reign was a slow-motion collapse. The nobility hated him. His wife Isabella of France eventually hated him, and when she teamed up with her charmingly ruthless ally Roger Mortimer, Edward's fate was sealed. He was deposed, imprisoned, and while he wasn't executed in the Tower, many of his supporters were held there. The Tower had become a waiting room for bad endings. And then there are the children. Because medieval royalty loved producing heirs and then had absolutely no idea what to do with them. Which leads us to one of the Tower's most famous and quietly tragic stories, The Princes in the Tower. Edward V and his younger brother Richard were brought to the Tower in 1483. Officially, it was for their protection. Unofficially, everyone involved was extremely nervous. Their uncle, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, would soon become Richard III. The boys were seen less and less, then not at all. And that was it. No public execution, no official announcement, just silence, which in history usually is worse. The Tower didn't scream, it didn't explain, it just absorbed another mystery and carried on. By now, the Tower had seen queens locked away, kings undone, children vanish, and nobles age quietly behind stone walls, while everyone pretended not to notice. And then the Tudors arrived, which is where things get personal. Henry VIII took the throne after years of civil war and immediately became obsessed with stability, which for him meant surveillance, paperwork, and keeping a very close eye on everyone. The Tower became a financial archive, an armory, a mint, and still a prison, always a prison. But it was his son, Henry VIII, who truly leaned into the Tower's emotional potential. Henry VIII didn't just use the Tower, he personalized it. Before every coronation, Henry would stay there, because tradition, and also because he enjoyed the symbolism of power looming over the city. Later, he sent people there, friends, advisors, wives, especially wives. Anne Boleyn entered the Tower as queen-in-waiting. She left it not that way. Her time in the Tower before execution was quiet, almost calm. She joked, she prayed, she waited. The Tower didn't judge, it never does. It just holds space for terrible decisions. After Anne came Catherine Howard, young, naive, and deeply unprepared for Tudor politics. She too spent her final days within those walls. By this point, the Tower had stopped being shocking. It was just expected. Power rose, power fell, the Tower remained. And that's where we'll pause for now. The Tower still stands. Kings are still anxious. Queens are still disposable. And medieval childhood remains one long audition for tragedy.
All right, welcome back. If you drifted off a little, that's perfect. That's the correct response to medieval history. When we last left off, the Tower of London was doing what it does best, standing there quietly while powerful people ruined their own lives. And now, we're fully inside the Tudor era, which is when the Tower stopped being a passive observer and became more like a recurring character. Not a villain, more like that emotionally unavailable friend who's always present when things go terribly wrong. Let's linger with Henry VIII a bit longer. Not because he deserves it, but because he absolutely insists. Henry grew up near the Tower. He knew it well. He liked it, which already tells you something. As a child, Henry wasn't supposed to be king. That job belonged to his older brother, Arthur. Arthur, unfortunately, died young, which meant Henry was suddenly important. And when medieval children became important, they were immediately wrapped in pressure, expectations, and the quiet understanding that love was conditional. Henry was spoiled, praised, and told he was exceptional, continuously, for years, which explains a lot. When Henry became king, the Tower became a place of royal processing. If you were accused of treason, heresy, or mildly annoying the king, you might take a short trip there to reflect. And reflection usually involved cold stone walls and too much time alone. Henry's reign filled the Tower with people who had once been very close to him. That's the thing about Tudor loyalty. It expired quickly. Advisors like Thomas More, once trusted, ended up imprisoned and executed. Religious figures, political rivals, former friends. The Tower became a kind of emotional recycling bin. Now let's talk about children, because the Tudors were excellent at producing them and terrible at emotionally supporting them. Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, both spent time associated with the Tower in different ways, and neither experience was comforting. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, watched her mother cast aside, declared illegitimate, and slowly erased from court life. Mary herself was demoted from princess to lady-in-waiting. She lived under constant threat. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, learned early that royal affection could vanish overnight. When Anne was arrested, Elizabeth was barely 3. She would later be imprisoned in the Tower herself under her sister Mary's reign, which is awkward. Imagine being a princess who had once walked freely through court, now quietly escorted into the same building where your mother lost her head. That does things to a person. Elizabeth handled it by becoming emotionally guarded, hyper-intelligent, and extremely careful, which probably saved her life. Mary, on the other hand, grew up anxious, deeply religious, and resentful. Also understandable. When Mary I became queen, the Tower didn't get a rest. It hosted Protestants, rebels, and people who simply found themselves on the wrong side of religious policy. Mary's reign is often remembered for burnings, but the Tower played its familiar role as a holding place, a pause, a waiting room. Then came Elizabeth I, who trusted no one, married no one, and kept the Tower exactly where she could see it. Elizabeth rarely used the Tower as brutally as her father or sister, but she understood its symbolism. It was a reminder. The Tower didn't need to be used often. Just knowing it existed was enough. And then, the Tudors ended. Which sounds like a relief. It wasn't, because the Stuarts arrived, and they brought new flavors of dysfunction. James I inherited a kingdom filled with religious tension, political paranoia, and one very old, very judgmental Tower. James didn't like executions. He preferred surveillance, plots, interrogations, which worked out nicely because people kept plotting. The most famous, of course, was the gunpowder plot. Guy Fawkes and his associates were arrested, interrogated, and yes, held in the Tower. The Tower's instruments of questioning were used, reluctantly, officially, but used. By now, the Tower had absorbed centuries of whispered confessions, anxious pacing, and long nights where people stared at walls and reconsidered their life choices. It had layers, physical layers, emotional layers. Now let's slow down and talk about what it was actually like to be imprisoned there, because not all prisoners were treated the same. If you were noble, you might have rooms, furniture, books, visitors. You could complain, write letters, be bored. If you weren't noble, the experience was colder, darker, more damp. The Tower was less a single prison and more a complex ecosystem of hierarchy. Even in confinement, class mattered. And children were not exempt. Which brings us to a softer tragedy.
royal children raised in fear. Many princes and princesses grew up knowing the tower not as a legend, but a real place that might someday receive them. They learned early not to trust easily, to speak carefully, to perform loyalty. Childhood for them was rehearsal. By the time we reach the English Civil War, the tower is old, worn, but still useful. It held royalists, parliamentarians, weapons, treasures. When Charles I lost his head, not in the tower, but still, it marked a turning point. The tower didn't disappear, but its role changed. Kings were no longer untouchable, and the tower, once a symbol of absolute monarchy, became something more historical than immediate. Still, it continued to function. Jacobite rebels, political prisoners, occasional traitors. But the energy was different. By the 18th century, the tower was becoming a place people visited, looked at, talked about. It was transitioning from threat to artifact, which is strange when you think about it. Imagine living near a building that once decided the fate of empires, now selling souvenirs. The ravens stayed, the walls stayed, the silence stayed, but the fear softened. Executions moved elsewhere, imprisonments became rarer, the tower settled into memory. And memory, unlike power, is quiet. By the 19th century, the tower was officially historic, guarded, preserved. It still held meaning, but no longer immediate consequences. No more spoiled princes vanishing behind walls, no more queens pacing cold floors before dawn. Just stories. And that's what the tower became best at, holding stories. We'll stop here for now. The tower has risen, peaked, and slowly stepped back into shadow. Not gone.
All right, let's ease back in. Same pace, same low lighting. The tower is still there, it always is, but now it's older, quieter, slightly tired of everyone's nonsense. By the time we reach the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Tower of London has technically retired from its main job. It's no longer the first place kings send their enemies. That role has moved on. Institutions have evolved. Anxiety has modernized. But the tower doesn't vanish. It never does. Instead, it becomes something stranger, a memory warehouse. People still get imprisoned there occasionally, mostly political rebels, Jacobites who backed the wrong royal branch, the kind of people who lost a gamble and ended up in a very old building full of judgment. These later prisoners often wrote about their time in the tower, and their accounts are subdued. No screaming, no constant torture, just boredom, cold stone, and the crushing awareness that history is staring at you from every wall. One prisoner described the tower as feeling like time itself had slowed down out of spite, which feels accurate. The tower also continued to serve as a ceremonial space. Kings and queens still processed through it before coronations, not because they needed to, but because tradition has a strong grip and medieval vibes die hard. You walk through the tower, you're reminded of who came before you and how they ended. Subtle, but effective. Now, let's talk about the beefeaters, because they quietly kept this place alive. Officially known as the yeoman warders, they lived inside the tower. They raised families there. Children grew up playing near execution sites, which sounds unsettling but became normal. That's how normalization works. Imagine growing up where adults casually say things like, "Oh, that's where a queen lost her head. Dinner's at 6." The tower was no longer frightening because it was violent. It was frightening because it was familiar. And then there are the ravens. Ah, yes, the ravens. By this point, legend had settled in. If the ravens ever left the tower, the kingdom would fall. So naturally, they were fed, protected, and occasionally trimmed so they wouldn't fly too far. An entire empire reduced to a bird retention program. And honestly, that tracks. As Britain expanded outward, colonies, navies, global influence, the tower stood still. It didn't participate, it observed. The people running the empire no longer feared the tower. They feared paperwork, budgets, public opinion, which might be worse. During the Victorian era, the tower was carefully restored, cleaned, organized, which is a polite way of saying its rough edges were softened. Execution sites became plaques, cells became exhibits, dark corners were lit. The tower was being turned into a story you could walk through, and visitors came, lots of them. They whispered, they pointed, they asked questions. They tried to imagine what it had been like to be imprisoned there. Most of them couldn't, because the fear wasn't loud. It was quiet, administrative. You weren't tortured constantly. You waited. And waiting is exhausting. By the time we reach the 20th century, the tower's role is almost entirely symbolic. Almost. During World War I and World War II, it briefly returned to its old job. Spies were imprisoned there. Some were executed by firing squad. Not public, not theatrical, just efficient. The tower didn't celebrate its return to relevance. It just opened the door and closed it again. After the wars, that was it. No more executions, no more high-profile prisoners. The tower was officially done. But its psychological footprint remained, because every story about the tower isn't really about the building. It's about power and fear condensed into stone. It's about kings who didn't trust their wives, queens who raised children in political minefields, princes who learned too early that survival meant silence. The tower didn't create dysfunction, it stored it. Now, let's gently step back and consider the children again, because they're the quiet thread running through all of this. Royal children saw the tower before they understood it. They grew up knowing its outline, its presence. They learned, without being told, that authority had consequences. Some became cautious, some became cruel. Some became emotionally distant adults who ruled entire countries without ever feeling safe, and the tower just watched. Even now, when tourists walk through, there's a strange calm to the place. Not peace, calm, the kind that comes from knowing the worst already happened. No building should have this many stories, and yet, the tower outlived dynasties, outlasted ideologies, survived modernization. It absorbed the rise of monarchy, the fracture of power, and the slow transition into something resembling accountability. And it did it without moving, which is impressive when you think about it. So, as we wind down this long, gentle drift through history, remember this: the Tower of London was never just a prison, it was a mirror. It reflected the anxieties of whoever ruled, their insecurities, their fears of losing control. And when they were done with it, the tower kept their secrets. That's where we'll rest tonight. Stone walls, quiet footsteps, ravens settling in.
All right, let's keep drifting. Same slow pace, same soft mental lighting. Nothing sudden is going to happen. The tower doesn't do sudden anymore. By the time the Tower of London fully steps into the modern world, it has already done everything it was ever going to do. It has scared kings, it has broken queens, it has watched children grow up too fast and adults behave like children. Now its job is different. It remembers. And remembering, strangely enough, is harder than ruling. As Britain moves through the 18th and 19th centuries, power spreads outward. Parliament matters more. Public opinion becomes inconveniently loud. Monarchs are still important, but not terrifying in the old way, which means the tower doesn't loom the way it used to. It becomes background, but not forgotten. Victorian Britain loved history, loved categorizing it, labeling it, putting it behind glass. So the tower is cleaned, cataloged, and gently reshaped into something visitors can safely consume. This is when the tower starts telling its stories on purpose. Guides develop scripts, artifacts are displayed, executions are discussed politely, like awkward family scandals from long ago. "Oh yes, several people died here," the tone suggests, "but we've moved on," which is optimistic. The crown jewels are installed, and suddenly the tower is glamorous again, sparkly, secure. It's a strange pivot for a place that once specialized in despair, but it works. Tourists come to see gold, not ghosts. They shuffle through rooms once soaked in anxiety, now brightly lit and carefully managed. And the tower behaves. It doesn't contradict the narrative. It never does. But if you stay long enough, or if you've read enough, you realize something. The tower isn't scary because of what happened there. It's scary because of how normal it all became. Executions were scheduled. Imprisonments were bureaucratic. Children were collateral. This wasn't chaos. It was administration. And administration is always calm. Now let's slow down and revisit the idea of royal childhood, because this is where the tower's emotional legacy really settles in. Medieval and early modern royal children weren't raised to be happy. They were raised to be useful. They learned obedience early. They learned performance. They learned that affection could be withdrawn without warning. The tower stood as proof. It didn't need to threaten them directly. It existed. Parents didn't say, "Behave or you'll end up in the tower." They didn't have to. The implication hung in the air. So when we see later monarchs, cold, distant, paranoid, it's not surprising. They were raised in a system where love and safety were temporary. The tower was the punctuation mark at the end of every lesson.
All right, one last time. Same calm rhythm, same soft focus. Nothing new is about to happen, which is exactly how the tower prefers it. By now, the Tower of London has outlived every person who ever feared it, every king who used it, every queen who walked through its gates trying to look brave, every child who glanced at it and quietly learned an unspoken lesson about power. And that might be its greatest accomplishment. Because the tower never needed a dramatic ending. It didn't collapse in flames. It didn't get torn down by revolution. It simply remained. In the modern world, the tower exists in an odd emotional space. It's official, maintained, insured, and yet it still feels heavy. Not haunted in the ghost story sense, haunted in the bureaucratic sense. This is where decisions were finalized, where paperwork became destiny, where someone could wake up a noble and go to sleep a criminal. And the building never argued. Visitors today walk slowly through the tower. They lower their voices without being asked. They read plaques and nod. Everyone reacts the same way, even if they don't know why. Because the tower doesn't tell you what to feel, it just lets you notice it. The stones are thick. The rooms are smaller than expected. The ceilings press down slightly. It becomes clear very quickly that this wasn't a place designed for comfort. It was designed for waiting. Waiting to be judged, waiting to be forgiven, waiting to be forgotten. And for centuries, that waiting defined the lives of people who were supposedly powerful. That's the irony. The tower was built to protect kings from their enemies, but over time, it mostly protected kings from their own paranoia. Every generation of rulers reused it for the same reason. They were afraid. Afraid of rivals, afraid of betrayal, afraid of their own families, especially their families. Royal households were emotional pressure cookers. Marriages were political. Children were assets. Affection was conditional. And when something went wrong, which it always did, the tower was there. Not yelling, not judging, just opening its doors. That's why so many royal children grew into anxious adults, why so many monarchs were distant, controlling, or quietly miserable. They grew up knowing the tower wasn't symbolic, it was real. It existed, and it had expectations. So when people talk about the fall of the Tower of London, it's not really accurate. The tower didn't fall. The world around it changed. Absolute monarchy faded. Public accountability crept in. Power stopped needing stone walls and started preferring paperwork. The tower became obsolete, not because it failed, but because fear evolved. And that's a strange kind of victory. Today, the tower is curated, explained, managed. The ravens are still there, still fed, still quietly doing their part to keep the myth alive. The crown jewels glitter under lights that didn't exist when they were first locked away for safety. Beef eaters tell stories they've told 1,000 times and still manage to sound respectful, because even repetition doesn't fully drain the weight from these walls. The tower has become a place where history is contained, safely framed. But containment doesn't erase memory. Every story of betrayal, every spoiled prince, every anxious queen, every silent disappearance, they're still here. Not as warnings, not as lessons, just as echoes. And maybe that's the most fitting ending possible. The Tower of London began as a declaration of power. It became a tool of fear, then a symbol, then a museum. And through all of it, it stayed exactly where it was, watching generations come and go, watching people convince themselves they were different from those who came before. They weren't. They never are. So tonight, as you let this story fade out, remember this quiet truth. Buildings don't change history. People do.
Buildings just remember it better. The tower doesn't need prisoners anymore. It already has all the stories it will ever need. That's the rise, that's the fall, and that's the long, quiet afterward. Sleep well. The tower is still standing.
All right, one last time. Same calm rhythm, same soft focus. Nothing new is about to happen, which is exactly how the tower prefers it. By now, the Tower of London has outlived every person who ever feared it, every king who used it, every queen who walked through its gates trying to look brave, every child who glanced at it and quietly learned an unspoken lesson about power. And that might be its greatest accomplishment. Because the tower never needed a dramatic ending. It didn't collapse in flames. It didn't get torn down by revolution. It simply remained. In the modern world, the tower exists in an odd emotional space. It's official, maintained, insured, and yet it still feels heavy. Not haunted in the ghost story sense, haunted in the bureaucratic sense. This is where decisions were finalized, where paperwork became destiny, where someone could wake up a noble and go to sleep a criminal. And the building never argued. Visitors today walk slowly through the tower. They lower their voices without being asked. They read plaques and nod. Everyone reacts the same way, even if they don't know why. Because the tower doesn't tell you what to feel, it just lets you notice it. The stones are thick. The rooms are smaller than expected. The ceilings press down slightly. It becomes clear very quickly that this wasn't a place designed for comfort. It was designed for waiting. Waiting to be judged, waiting to be forgiven, waiting to be forgotten. And for centuries, that waiting defined the lives of people who were supposedly powerful. That's the irony. The tower was built to protect kings from their enemies, but over time, it mostly protected kings from their own paranoia. Every generation of rulers reused it for the same reason. They were afraid. Afraid of rivals, afraid of betrayal, afraid of their own families, especially their families. Royal households were emotional pressure cookers. Marriages were political. Children were assets. Affection was conditional. And when something went wrong, which it always did, the tower was there. Not yelling, not judging, just opening its doors. That's why so many royal children grew into anxious adults, why so many monarchs were distant, controlling, or quietly miserable. They grew up knowing the tower wasn't symbolic, it was real. It existed, and it had expectations. So when people talk about the fall of the Tower of London, it's not really accurate. The tower didn't fall. The world around it changed. Absolute monarchy faded. Public accountability crept in. Power stopped needing stone walls and started preferring paperwork. The tower became obsolete, not because it failed, but because fear evolved. And that's a strange kind of victory. Today, the tower is curated, explained, managed. The ravens are still there, still fed, still quietly doing their part to keep the myth alive. The crown jewels glitter under lights that didn't exist when they were first locked away for safety. Beef eaters tell stories they've told 1,000 times and still manage to sound respectful, because even repetition doesn't fully drain the weight from these walls. The tower has become a place where history is contained, safely framed. But containment doesn't erase memory. Every story of betrayal, every spoiled prince, every anxious queen, every silent disappearance, they're still here. Not as warnings, not as lessons, just as echoes. And maybe that's the most fitting ending possible. The Tower of London began as a declaration of power. It became a tool of fear, then a symbol, then a museum. And through all of it, it stayed exactly where it was.
watching generations come and go, watching people convince themselves they were different from those who came before. They weren't. They never are. So tonight, as you let this story fade out, remember this quiet truth. Buildings don't change history. People do. Buildings just remember it better. The tower doesn't need prisoners anymore. It already has all the stories it will ever need. That's the rise, that's the fall, and that's the long, quiet afterward. Sleep well. The tower is still standing.
All right. Still moving slowly. Still no sharp turns. If you're surprised we're still going, don't worry. So's the tower. It's been continuing quietly for nearly 1,000 years. One more part won't bother it. By now, the Tower of London has shifted fully from event to habit, and habits are harder to break than fear. Fear demands attention. Habit just sits there, unquestioned. For centuries, people didn't ask why the tower existed. It simply did, like weather, like gravity, like the idea that someone, somewhere, was always watching. And when something went wrong, a rebellion, a rumor, an inconvenient relative, the answer was already built. Send them to the tower. Not because it was cruel, because it was familiar. Familiarity is incredibly powerful. Kings used the tower not only to punish, but to reassure themselves. If someone was inside those walls, the problem felt contained, out of sight, out of circulation, out of conversation. And that worked, again and again. Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth about the tower's legacy. It didn't survive because it was brutal. It survived because it was useful. That's always the more dangerous option. When the tower stopped holding prisoners, it didn't stop holding meaning. It just stopped being questioned. People accepted it as part of the landscape, part of the story, part of national identity. And identity is sticky. By the time modern Britain emerged, industrialized, bureaucratic, paper-heavy, the tower had already trained people how to behave around authority. Stand in line, lower your voice, wait for permission. These lessons weren't written down. They didn't need to be. They were absorbed over generations. That's why the tower still feels serious, even when nothing serious is happening. You don't joke loudly there. You don't rush. Your body adjusts before your mind does. That's not architecture. That's conditioning. Now, let's briefly revisit the idea of royal dysfunction, because it's easy to forget just how deeply unnatural those lives were. Royal children were raised in public and punished in private. They were praised loudly and corrected quietly. They learned that affection could be political, that love could be revoked, that safety had conditions. The tower loomed in the background of all of this, not as a threat spoken aloud, that would have been crude, but as an understood endpoint. A reminder that proximity to power was never protection, it was exposure. And many rulers carried that lesson into adulthood. That's why so many monarchs were distant parents, why they favored control over closeness, why paranoia outlived reason. They weren't born cruel, they were raised alert. And the tower rewarded alertness. It didn't care if you were right or wrong. It cared if you were inconvenient. That's an important distinction. The tower didn't enforce morality. It enforced stability. And stability, historically, has very low standards. As time passed, this logic seeped into institutions beyond monarchy, courts, prisons, offices, not copying the tower directly, but echoing its philosophy. Contain first, explain later. The tower was an early lesson in how systems behave when they feel threatened, and systems, once built, don't feel things like guilt. They just continue, which makes the tower's quiet retirement all the more interesting. It wasn't replaced by something kinder, it was replaced by something subtler. Walls became procedures, cells became files, sentences became delays. The tower didn't disappear because we outgrew it, we just internalized it. And that's why it still feels relevant. Not because it could imprison someone tomorrow, it won't, but because its logic still exists everywhere else. Which is soothing in a strange way, because at least the tower is honest about what it was. It doesn't pretend to be benevolent. It doesn't pretend to be fair. It just stands there and lets you project meaning onto it. That's why people keep returning to its stories, the princes, the queens, the quiet endings. Not because they are dramatic, they aren't, but because they feel familiar. Power rarely collapses in flames. It usually fades into routine, and the tower mastered routine. So as this long, drifting narrative continues, it's okay if your thoughts wander. That's appropriate. The tower doesn't demand attention. It never did. It simply waits to be noticed. And even now, with glass skyscrapers and modern governments surrounding it, the tower doesn't compete. It doesn't need to. It already won the only contest that mattered. It lasted. We'll keep going next time, gently easing toward the very last stretch where history finally lets go and the tower becomes exactly what it always was underneath everything else. Just stone, just silence, just memory. Stay slow. Nothing is chasing us.
All right. Still here. Still slow. At this point, the Tower of London isn't really doing anything anymore. And that's important. Because for most of its existence, the tower was reacting to threats, to rumors, to kings who couldn't sleep at night and decided that locking someone up might help. Now it doesn't react at all. It just exists. And existence, without urgency, changes how a place feels. There's no tension left in the tower, no anticipation, no sense that something is about to happen. Everything that could happen there already did. That's why the tower feels settled in a way most historical sites don't. It isn't waiting for relevance to return. It isn't hoping for a revival. It's done. And there's something deeply calming about a place that knows it's finished. When historians talk about the tower today, they don't argue much. There are debates, of course, details, timelines, motives, but the larger meaning is already agreed upon. The tower was a tool, an effective one, and a deeply revealing one. It shows us how power behaves when it's insecure, which is to say, always. Every king who used the tower believed they were defending order. Every queen who feared it understood that order was fragile. And the tower sat in the middle, not caring who was right. That's why it survived so well in public memory. It doesn't take sides. You can visit the tower and feel sympathy for the prisoners. You can also understand, uncomfortably, why the rulers thought it was necessary. Both reactions can exist at once. That ambiguity is rare. Most historical symbols get simplified over time. Villain, hero, tragedy, triumph. The tower resists that. It doesn't resolve neatly. It doesn't redeem itself. It doesn't apologize. It just lets the contradictions sit there. And contradictions are tiring. Which is probably why your brain feels heavy when you think about it. That's not boredom. That's processing. Now, let's gently revisit one last theme that's been hovering in the background the entire time. Inheritance. Not crowns, not titles. Habits.
The tower didn't first influence kings, it influenced how governance learned to behave. It taught authority to value containment over conversation, silence over explanation, delay over decision. And those habits didn't vanish when monarchs lost power. They migrated into courts, into bureaucracies, into systems that still feel calm while doing irreversible things. The tower didn't invent this behavior, it refined it. Which is why studying it feels oddly modern. The people who built and used the tower didn't think they were cruel, they thought they were practical. And practicality is always the most dangerous justification, because it doesn't feel emotional, it feels reasonable. The tower is the architectural embodiment of "this is unfortunate but necessary," and history is full of that sentence. So when people say the Tower of London has fallen, what they usually mean is that it no longer acts. But influence doesn't require action. Sometimes all it takes is presence. The tower still shapes how people imagine power, still colors how authority feels. It reminds us that for a very long time, power didn't bother explaining itself. It simply built walls and waited. And waiting, again, is exhausting. Which brings us back to the present moment, you listening, probably not fully awake, not fully asleep. That's the right state for this story. Because the tower's legacy isn't something you analyze sharply. It's something you absorb slowly, like pressure, like gravity. You don't notice it working. You just notice that things settle differently because it's there. And maybe that's the quiet conclusion we've been circling this whole time. The Tower of London didn't fall because it failed. It fell because it succeeded too well. It showed everyone exactly how power could behave. And once that lesson was learned, the building no longer needed to teach it. So now it rests. Stone, silence, routine. No prisoners, no decisions. Just the echo of footsteps that no longer arrive. We're very close to the end now. Nothing dramatic left to uncover. Just one final drift where history stops speaking altogether and lets the tower fade fully into what it has always been underneath everything else. We'll take that last step together, slowly, next time.
All right, this is the last stretch. Nothing new is coming, and that's exactly the point. By now, the Tower of London has been talked about, walked through, analyzed, romanticized, and quietly misunderstood more times than anyone can count. And after all of that attention, it ends up in the same place it always does, standing still. Because the tower's real story was never about movement, it was about containment. Containing people, containing fear, containing uncertainty. And once a society learns how to contain those things without walls, the walls themselves become optional. That's what finally happened. The tower didn't lose relevance overnight. It wasn't replaced by something better. It was slowly absorbed into a world that learned to do the same work more quietly. That's why there's no dramatic final chapter for the tower, no symbolic destruction, no triumphant closure. It simply faded into usefulness of a different kind, a reminder instead of a threat. When people visit today, they aren't really there to learn new facts. Most already know the basics: kings, queens, executions, princes who never came out. What they're really doing is checking something. They want to see if the place feels the way the stories say it should. And it does. Not loudly, not aggressively, just heavy, which is remarkable considering nothing bad has happened there in a very long time. That weight doesn't come from ghosts, it comes from repetition. Century after century of the same decision being made by different people who all believed they were exceptions. I'll only use it once.
This time it's justified. This is necessary. And then someone else said the same thing. The tower heard it all and never responded. That's why, in the end, the tower feels less like a monument to cruelty and more like a monument to anxiety. Anxiety made of stone. Anxiety passed down through bloodlines, reinforced through childhoods, normalized through ritual. Kings didn't build the tower because they were confident. They built it because they were afraid. Afraid of rebellion, afraid of betrayal, afraid of being replaced. And in that way, the tower is one of the most honest structures ever built. It doesn't pretend power is noble. It shows power exactly as it often is: defensive, suspicious, exhausted. So when we talk about the rise and fall of the Tower of London, what we're really describing is a shift in how fear operates. The rise was visible, the fall was internal. The walls didn't disappear, the mindset just moved elsewhere. And that's why the tower still matters, not as a prison, not as a palace, but as a physical reminder of how easily systems normalize quiet harm when it's wrapped in tradition and necessity. That sounds heavy, but it doesn't need to be alarming, because the tower also shows us something else, that even the most powerful systems eventually stop being needed, that fear changes shape, that permanence is an illusion. The tower stands now not because it must, but because it can, and because remembering is safer than repeating. So as this long, slow story finally settles, as your thoughts drift and your breathing evens out, there's nothing left to hold on to. No cliffhanger, no lesson spelled out. Just a very old building by a river doing what it's done for centuries, standing quietly, letting time pass, and keeping its stories without insisting you carry them. That's the end. Not dramatic, not loud, just finished. Sleep well. The tower isn't watching. It's resting.
All right. We're very nearly done now. No sudden events, no climaxes, no revelations. Just the tower, quietly existing, as it has for nearly a millennium. By this point, the Tower of London is no longer a fortress, a prison, or even a royal residence. It has become memory made physical. Every stone, every narrow passage, every shadowed corridor holds centuries of quiet repetition. The footsteps of kings who couldn't sleep, queens who paced anxiously, children learning early that safety is conditional, prisoners learning that waiting is a form of endurance. And the building keeps all of it, not to shame, not to judge, just to be present. In this way, the tower is less about power and more about reflection. It doesn't enforce obedience anymore. It enforces perspective. Visitors can wander through, listen to guides, see the crown jewels sparkle, and imagine the stories. But the tower doesn't need them to imagine. It already knows. The real fall of the tower, if we can call it that, was never physical. It was psychological. Society evolved. Power moved elsewhere. Fear became abstract. The tower's lessons were internalized. It went from active participant to silent witness, quietly shaping behavior by its mere presence. A monument not to cruelty, but to the slow, inexorable rhythms of authority, anxiety, and human expectation. And that's why it feels familiar. Even today, when you step inside, you might notice yourself unconsciously lowering your voice, pausing longer than necessary, feeling the weight of observation without anyone actually observing. It's a subtle power, and it's been honed over centuries. The tower doesn't need to act. It never did. It simply exists,
and that's enough. For the royal children, the princes and princesses, the spoiled heirs and anxious queens, the tower's presence shaped their lives more effectively than threats or punishments ever could. Its silence was the backdrop of upbringing. Its walls were the margins of history. Its legacy was absorbed quietly, internally, and passed on. And today, that quiet legacy continues. Tourists walk its floors, historians study its records, and the tower remains exactly what it has always been, a repository of human fear, ambition, and the slow, subtle consequences of power. There's no end beyond this. The tower doesn't need one. It has already completed its work. So, as you drift off, let the story settle. The tower isn't watching. It isn't waiting. It's simply standing. Stone, memory, silence, and centuries of history quietly preserved, finally at rest. Sleep well.